Hello. Thomas Hobbes of Malmesbury is my favorite philosopher. His famous Leviathan was in fact the first philosophical book I've ever read, and since then I haven't stopped reading philosophical literature ever again. He was the start of my personal philosophical journey, and he always was an important part of it, even being at least partially the topic of several papers that I had to write for university. Over the years, I came across a few quite common misconceptions regarding Thomas Hobbes and his philosophy. Three of the most common ones shall be addressed in this short video essay. First, Homo homini lupus est. Or maybe not. With the name Thomas Hobbes, most of us will instantly think of two phrases. One is war of all against all, and the other one is Homo homini lupus est, or just Homo homini lupus. There are multiple reasons for this connotation, and one that really bothers me: schoolbooks tell us about these phrases without giving proper context. Maybe it's different in your country and you have heard more or even less about Hobbes, but when I was in my 8th grade, our history book didn't teach us more than these two famous phrases. About 20 lines of text, the cover of Leviathan, Hobbes' most well-known book, portraits of him, John Locke, and Jean-Jacques Rousseau. That was all we got regarding political philosophy of the early modern times. Our teacher didn't add much to it either, and why should he? His subjects were history and German, not politics or philosophy. I was really an edgy teenager back then, and based on these two little phrases, I decided that Hobbes was like a really cool guy, with a bit of a goth vibe going on, talking in wolf metaphors and thinking of mankind as a brutal, warmongering species. If I only had known that Homo homini lupus is a very bad summary of Hobbes' philosophy. First, we have to find this phrase in his writings, and there are many of them, so it's probably going to take the reader a while. But even after reading all of his major texts, we still miss this phrase. Where is it? Was it just made up by people who thought that it would sound good? No, that's not the case. When dealing with philosophical texts, it's unwise to skip parts that we often just ignore whilst reading a novel. Parts like a preface, for example, or in this case, the epistle dedicatory. In Paris, in 1642, De Cive was published in Latin. 1651 in London followed the release of the English version under the title of Philosophical Rudiments Concerning Government and Society. Since both versions were written by Hobbes, we can stick to the English one for now. Finally, we found our piece of text. De Cive is nowadays nowhere near as well known as Leviathan, but it's one of Hobbes' most important books. At this point, we should already be asking, can a single phrase from the epistle dedicatory really be taken as the summary of Hobbes' philosophy? No, it can't. One quick look into the text shows us that it's not even the entire sentence. I quote, "To speak impartially, both sayings are very true. That man to man is a kind of god, and that man to man is an errant wolf." He continues with, "The first is true if we compare citizens amongst themselves, and the second if we compare cities." End quote. Hobbes, the formidable historian and classicist, refers in the entire section of the text to a speech of Pontius Telesinus, the last leader of the Italic Samnites before they were annexed by the Romans in the 1st century BC. Telesinus speaks of Rome as the origin of the wolves that are after the liberty of the Samnites. This connection to Rome is probably one major reason for why Hobbes talks about wolves and not one of the other European predators. But now we have two variants of what man is to man. They're both sides of the same coin, and just referring to the wolves means to ignore 50% of the content. So it obviously can't be the sum of Hobbes' philosophy. A quick recap. Homo homini lupus is just a partial phrase taken from the epistle dedicatory of a book that counts about 300 pages. Yes, man is to man a wolf, but keep in mind that this coin has another side and it's equally important. The entire sentence will explain itself to the reader of the entire book, and this duality has an important place in Hobbes' political thought, but it does not summarize it at all, especially then if only one half of it is being used. Second, this misconception shares some similarities with the first one, and it's most likely a consequence of the common use of homo homini lupus and war of all against all. Like I already said, I myself fell victim to this issue because of how these phrases sound if there's no proper context given. Good and evil. When talking about human nature, Thomas Hobbes does not use these codes. We can judge acts as good, bad, or evil, can judge maybe even individuals. Many philosophers have many diverse thoughts on this topic, but these designations just don't fit Hobbes' concept of human nature. Hobbes describes mankind as a species of rational beings. The primary goal of a rational being is to ensure its own survival. A rational being seeks the means to survival and avoids harm because it fears the loss of said means. This rational fear is the cause of the war of all against all, and ultimately the reason for why the rational being realizes that peace is more pragmatic regarding the ultimate goal, survival. Mankind is not evil for fighting this war because it's a necessity dictated by reason, and mankind is also not good for making peace. That's also just dictated by reason. Hobbes calls these dictations even laws of nature. A functioning human being will act according to these laws, for they are part of his very nature. I can understand why so many people think that Hobbes' concept of mankind is so negative, but it's quite neutral. It doesn't really care about good or bad. For me, it was initially quite hard to banish this conviction from the back of my mind while reading Leviathan. I hope that the common idea of what Hobbes' mankind is like will change someday so that people can read this text without looking through the lenses of this misconception. Third, Thomas Hobbes the atheist. Hobbes is often called an atheist. This allegation is nothing new. He was suspected to be one even during his lifetime, but was he really? In the early modern times, calling somebody an atheist was often just a way to discredit a public figure. You don't like what person X writes or teaches? Let's call him an atheist, and it will be easier to fight him intellectually after we attacked him ideologically. Also, atheism back then is not to be confused with our modern atheism, which is a respectable branch of philosophy by itself. The idea that there is no such thing as deity was not really discussed by the likes of Thomas Hobbes. What we can say with certainty is that his way of working with the Bible was not the usual one as seen on multiple occasions. It was quite common to make an argument supported by quoting one of the church fathers, usually Augustine of Hippo, and then backing it up with a quote from the Bible. Hobbes, not a big fan of scholasticism, didn't work with the church fathers, but rather with the Bible itself, and so he came up with pretty new ways of interpretation. This was not without consequences. Among others, the Archbishop of Canterbury, Gilbert Sheldon, intrigued against Hobbes with his accusations of atheism and heresy, unsuccessfully so. Another consequence comes from an unexpected direction. A Jewish thinker from the Netherlands, whose parents were migrating there from Portugal, wrote the Tractatus Theologico-Politicus and published it anonymously in 1670. This young man, known as Baruch de Spinoza or Benedictus Spinoza, obviously has read Hobbes' writings and further developed on some of Hobbes' ideas. These were the early beginnings of our modern ways of exegesis, like the historical critical method. Hobbes also proposed to separate political authority from religious aspects. This was understood as a frontal attack on the traditional divine right of kings, which, of course, it was indeed. It's one of the core elements of Hobbes' philosophy. Nowadays, when people call Hobbes an atheist, it's no longer an accusation. It's meant as a rather positive title. The idea of atheism is modern, trendy, and cool. People often tend to read any critique of a religious institution or even high-ranking officials of said institution as a sign of atheism. I've seen this quite often in discussions with my fellow students, and in some cases they were surely right. We all have our favorite philosophers, and I won't claim that I know more about one of their favorites than they do. But Hobbes did not just criticize multiple religious institutions, he also proposed how the role of religion and its institutions should look like. There's a major difference between criticizing an institution or a religion itself. One might add that even the total rejection of a certain religion does not make one an atheist. When we read Leviathan, we often just read the first two parts, of man and of commonwealth. The other two parts, of a Christian commonwealth and of the kingdom of darkness, are usually overlooked, and when I bought my first version of Leviathan, they were not even included in the book. Now that I have access to the collected works of Thomas Hobbes, as well as to a better, more accurate translation, I have to say that he invested way too much time and effort into these two parts for the atheist allegation being defendable based on nothing more than his disagreements with religious institutions and his proposition of what we call nowadays the separation of state and church. So, was Thomas Hobbes an atheist or not? The honest answer, I don't know, and neither does anyone else. We simply can't know for sure what his true personal beliefs were. Calling this sentence, Hobbes was an atheist, a misconception, is as valid as calling the sentence, Hobbes was a deeply religious man, a misconception. Based on my knowledge of the 17th century and the impression I got by reading his books, I'm convinced that Thomas Hobbes was not an atheist. These were the three misconceptions I came across the most in school, university, or random discussions. I fell for two of them myself when I first dipped my toe into the vast ocean that is our philosophical heritage. There are, of course, far more about Thomas Hobbes, as well as about pretty much every other philosopher. I hope you liked this short video essay, and I invite everybody to start or continue your own personal philosophical journey. We all have the same direction, but unique paths ahead of us. Goodbye.